In this video, we'll review the different classes of hormones. Remember that hormones are special signaling molecules that are released by a cell into the bloodstream, travel in the bloodstream, and subsequently bind to a receptor on another cell, a distant cell somewhere else in the body, and cause some sort of a change. And these are the signaling molecules of the endocrine system. There are a lot of different types of hormones, but they can be broadly classified into three categories based on their structure and what they are produced from. The first class are the amine hormones, or those that are derived from amino acids. And in this case, we have an example of norepinephrine, which is actually derived from the amino acid tyrosine. And actually, norepinephrine is part of a broader group called the catecholamines. And the catecholamines include this norepinephrine, as well as epinephrine, and then dopamine. And epinephrine, another name for that, is actually adrenaline. Okay? And these are all derived from tyrosine. Now, another amino acid that is used to produce hormones is actually tryptophan. And tryptophan can be used to produce melatonin, which is the sleep hormone, melatonin. And this is, of course, produced by your pineal gland. And then also serotonin, which is that kind of happiness hormone, I guess. But serotonin, okay? And then we also have histidine, which can actually be used to produce histamine, which can act as a hormone, okay? So these are just some examples of amino acid hormones. Now, these are all water soluble with one exception, and that exception is actually thyroid hormone. So the thing about thyroid hormone is this is derived also from tyrosine, but this is not water soluble. Instead, it kind of acts like a steroid hormone in that it is actually hydrophobic, and so it cannot travel in the bloodstream on its own. Skipping a little bit ahead, all hydrophobic or lipid-soluble hormones, including steroid hormone and thyroid hormone, require carrier proteins to travel in the bloodstream. So remember that the hydrophobic hormones, the lipid-soluble ones, are steroid hormones, and then specifically thyroid hormone. Next, we have the peptide hormones, and more broadly, the peptide or protein hormones. So these are, of course, hormones that are produced by multiple amino acids linked together to form a peptide or a protein. And this is by far the most broad or largest class of hormones because most of the hormones in our body are peptide or protein hormones. And there's a lot of examples. I wouldn't memorize all of them. I would just simply know which ones are the steroid hormones and which one are the amino acid hormones, and then know that the rest are protein hormones. But an example would be like oxytocin, okay? And these are, of course, all water soluble, okay? So these are H2O soluble, generally speaking, okay? Amino acid hormones are all water soluble with the exception of thyroid hormone. And then lastly, we have steroid hormones. So these are all derived from cholesterol. And the thing about cholesterol is that it has this very classic ring structure where you have 4 fused rings. And all of these steroid hormones are basically just cholesterol with a bunch of functional groups added at different positions. For example, you can see testosterone and you can see progesterone. The functional groups attached are different, but they both have these 4 fused rings. So what I would have memorized is not the specific structures, but just that 4 fused rings so that you can recognize that if you're asked, right? If you ever see something like this, odds are it's a steroid hormone of some sort. Now, all steroid hormones are lipid soluble, so they require carrier proteins in the bloodstream. So let's quickly compare and contrast the differences between water soluble and lipid soluble hormones. So let's compare these two. First of all, we have the water-soluble hormones, which include most of the amino acid hormones with the exception of thyroid hormone, and then all the protein/peptide hormones. And then we have the lipid-soluble hormones, which are all the steroid hormones, and then T3 and T4, which are collectively thyroid hormone, okay? Now, what are the differences? Well, first of all, water-soluble hormones don't require a carrier protein, so no carrier protein, okay? Whereas lipid-soluble hormones, since the blood is mostly water, lipid-soluble hormones do not dissolve in the blood, and instead they need some sort of protein to bind them and sort of shield them from the water around, okay? And so these require carrier proteins. And FYI, most of the carrier proteins in the body are actually produced by the liver. So liver dysfunction can result in deficiencies in carrier proteins for hormones, which can result in endocrine changes in liver disease. Now, another difference is how these hormones actually signal cells. So water-soluble hormones, even though they can travel in the bloodstream without a carrier, they cannot cross the plasma membrane of a cell because the plasma membrane is made up mostly of lipids. So water-soluble hormones are going to bind membrane receptors, okay, membrane receptors. They don't enter cells. And thinking back to molecular biology, the way that this signaling works is when they bind the membrane receptor, that results in a signaling cascade across the membrane, which basically involves different intermediary signaling molecules, part of the signaling cascade, to transmit that signal from outside the cell into the cell, resulting in some sort of cellular change. Now, lipid-soluble hormones are different. These actually are small, generally speaking, like T3 and T4 are very small. And actually, the cholesterol-derived steroid hormones are also very small. And then they're also nonpolar, so they can dissolve freely across the membrane, enter the cell, and when they enter the cell, they bind to some sort of intracellular receptor. Intracellular receptor, okay? And when they do so, that forms this complex that typically can actually enter the nucleus, bind to a region of DNA, and act as a transcription factor, either turning on or turning off genes. So those are really some of the main things you need to understand about the differences between these classes.